QuantSpeak, expert insights from quants for quants.
Welcome to QuantSpeak, a new podcast from the CQF Institute at Fitch Learning.
Hi, I'm Dan Tudball, editor of Wilmot Magazine, and this is QuantSpeak. You join me today on the dark side of the moon. Well, at least the album cover of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, you know, the one with a prism refracting light. In the world of financial asset allocation, AI, artificial intelligence, is often evangelized using the language of optics. It's like a lens allowing investors to see the market with greater clarity and focus. It's like a prism separating white light into its component colors, but instead revealing hidden patterns and trends in financial data. However, like the prism, AI isn't infallible. Its effectiveness depends on the quality of the data it's given, the skill of the user, and the context in which it's applied. And just as the prism can only reveal the colors that are present in white light, AI can only reveal the patterns that are present in the data. Nevertheless, The Dark Side of the Moon is a great album. I'm joined today by a returning guest, Grant Fuller, co-founder and CEO of Irithmics, the AI research and technology firm that has taken its foundation in public health and epidemiology to the financial markets. Grant is presenting a talk for the CQF Institute entitled Vicarious Risk, Estimating the Risk Identified by Others. Advances in data science and artificial intelligence facilitate recognition and classification of patterns in how information shapes institutional capital allocations. In doing so, the technology provides insight into how other market participants are affected by information and introduces vicarious risk, which provides new ways for portfolio and risk managers to quantify, monitor, and manage risk. In this talk, Grant Fuller explains the rationale behind vicarious risk, how AI enables it to be measured, and how it is being used to unlock alpha and mitigate risk. Welcome, Grant.
Hi, thank you. It's really nice to be back, actually.
It's great to have you here. The introduction probably shows I spent a lot of my youth in record shops rather than paying attention in physics class. But do you think finance is now fully sold on AI?
That's a good question. And is finance or is society and is everybody else? So, people are still discussing AI and some are being terrified of it and others are beating the tambourines quite happily on the street corners about how the world is going to be taken over by computers. I think irrespective of the sector and finance, we're talking about finance, so we'll stick to that. I think it is getting they're differentiating the hype from reality a lot more and are judging this technology by what it can do, and that is a good thing, right? What can this technology do? And because finance and in particular quants are very measured, their success and their credibility is a function of what they can physically do. And at the end of the day, a balance sheet and the profit and loss statement, you can't fudge that, right? If the numbers are green, everything's good. If they're red, everything's bad. And so it's very binary.
That's something I've tried to explain to my accountant as well, but for some reason, he thinks I don't get it. You first presented on vicarious views to the CQF Institute before the pandemic. Have your insights on vicarious risk evolved since then?
Yeah, I think the BC age, right, to the before COVID times. And actually, it's Michael Eichinger introduced and asked me to do a talk, present some research way back, and it seems like a lifetime ago now, but on vicarious risk. And I did, and you guys very kindly hosted it. It was an in-person event, which is hardly ever happens now anyway. And I spoke about vicarious risk, and I explained the rationale, and I explained some of the mathematics and why this conceptually made sense. And in the audience, again, it was in person, so that's quite a rare treat. That message seems to have resonated with a number of hedge fund managers that were present, and they, over coffee, they had a chat, and our relationship with them has grown significantly in this intervening time, as has our relationship with a number of universities, principally the University of St Andrews up in Scotland. So we work a lot with mathematicians and master's students on the raw data and the underlying deep learning and data science that underpins vicarious risk, essentially. So in that way, our understanding of this domain has changed a lot over time, and it's become much more refined, right? We've learned things that the technology can do amazingly well, and we've learned things that, while we would like the technology to do this, it can't actually do that. So we've learned a healthy dose of as reality, right? You can't put lipstick on the pig too much, and what you can do, which has surprised us a lot, is when AI and essentially AI, as you said in your introduction, is just algorithms and data, right? It's the augmentation, the fusion of those two constructs. It's actually amazing. It still makes me smile today when you realize that a machine, AI, algorithms and data can see patterns that human beings can't. And that still makes me smile. When you look at something and you go, a computer told me this. And then, of course, the next set of questions are, well, how does it know that? And, well, actually, humans don't even know that, because humans can't see those patterns either. So it becomes an interesting exercise of how do you translate what the machines can find to what humans can make sense of in our world, because of course a computer does not live in our world, right?
Absolutely. For those that weren't able to attend that talk back then, just a quick recap as to the definition of vicarious risk, if you don't mind.
No, that's a really good question, and I think you asked about have our understandings of vicarious risk evolved. And if yes, the answer is yes, of course. And a key part of that is, what is the definition of vicarious risk? And so I think there is no formal, well, certainly I haven't created a formal definition of it, but essentially it's the risk that others see that you do not. And, anecdotally, everyone who's ever been in a car understands this, right? You'll be driving along the freeway, the motorway, and you'll suddenly see the brake lights and the car in front, and the car in front of them, and the car in front of them come on. And this will affect your driving. And you don't need to understand or know why everyone in front of you is braking, or why everyone in front of you is changing lanes, or you don't need to understand any of that, but they have seen something that you have not. So, and that modifies your behavior. So in a way, that is vicarious risk. It is when you are able to make a change to your portfolio, if you're a quantitative fund manager, or if you're a quantitative risk manager, the advice and policies that you put in place about how your organization manages risk, not based upon what you see, not the volatility that you measure, for example, but the volatility that others are measuring. And that's a really interesting insight, right? How you can manage your business and your operations and your P&L actually through what other people are doing, not what you. And what the really interesting thing here is, for me anyway, right? You go from having a desk of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 analysts pouring their heart and soul, their intellectual efforts into understanding the market, the sector, the stock, to you go to thousands of analysts doing exactly the same. And it's when you've amplified your ability to understand markets beyond the people that you can physically see or the names that you know to thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, trillions of dollars worth of capitalization is flowing around the capital markets. And all that you're doing is watching where other people, how other people construct their portfolios, and you're learning from that. The huge thing is, of course, there's a translation exercise, but what does that mean to you and me as human beings? And that's where we have to become a little bit careful in how we translate that from purely a machine domain, which of course just sees this as numbers from -1 to 1 in our case. And what does that mean to a human being? And quant analysts and quants are very, very skilled at they're very comfortable in that domain, right? They're data, and they are perfectly at ease coming up with the statistical relationship that maps our data from -1 to +1 to data that they observe in the real world, volatility, stock returns, so on and so forth. And if you think about it, this is no different to looking at credit card transaction data, right? You're saying, well, we can spot credit card transaction data, and this tells us something about how customers are spending in the store, and therefore we expect the store's revenue to increase. And economics 101 would tell us that their stock price should therefore increase as well, or their value should increase. And that's what quant analysts have historically done with alternative data. Now, of course, that data is being generated by a machine, and they're trying to figure out how to make sense of that.
It's sort of a case of the why becomes even less important, because your ability to take in the what is sort of now on steroids, isn't it? Because through AI, you're able to aggregate so much from vast amounts of information that's available, the what, as it were, and as a result, make decisions on the basis of just the analysis of the what as to what you ought to do after that. Actually, your driving analogy just now reminded me of a slightly different driving situation, but again, lots of motorists on the road, and everybody's speeding, and then suddenly everybody starts to slow down because there's a speed trap up ahead. So this chap, he just decided to keep on bombing along, and got pulled over by the policeman. And he said, what were you doing? Why didn't you slow down? The driver's response was, well, I felt like a hypocrite. It was just basically a case of, the presence of authority suddenly creates behavior in the herd. But in his particular case, I suppose integrity was rather more important, but that's a complete aside. Going back to vicarious views, the principle remains the same, but the underpinnings of the technology which Irithmics puts to use, how's that changed over that period? How's that progressed?
So I think since we first introduced the idea of vicarious risk, and it sparked the imagination of the audience, some of the audience at the CQF Institute, and that encouraged us to carry on with this, as I said before. So the technology, you're absolutely right, the underlying technology that allows, or the methodology that allows us to do this has been extended and evolved, and the technology that underpins this has come on a lot. And so it went from being isn't this an interesting idea, to actually let's put some flesh on the bone, right? If we believe the idea is really interesting, why don't we put some money where our mouth is and build this out? And that's exactly what we've done. So now today, 17,000 listed corporates across the globe. Irithmics calculates this vicarious risk for those firms or on those stocks. This isn't Irithmics does not generate signals or alpha. I mean, that's the job of the portfolio manager and the risk manager. All that Irithmics is doing and that this technology is doing is really saying other people, their views are forming in this space. Now, we don't know if that's right or wrong, as in those views are right or wrong. We don't know why they're behaving in that particular way. We can simply see that these views are forming in this way. And this is where a really interesting segue of AI comes into its own. It's not just the ability to recognize and classify this, the length of a sepal and the length of a petal, and off we go. We're really happy. The next logical conclusion is to say, well, what does this mean in reality, right? Let's anticipate how these views are going to affect the real world. And it was Keynes, the economist, successful investing is anticipating the anticipations of others. And that is exactly what this AI is now able to do, to help us, to help human beings, to help quant managers, to help quant risk managers, and corporates actually, to anticipate what others are anticipating. And the reason for that is, if you are why that is so useful, if you are a corporate and you can see that others, and you can evaluate how others are anticipating things, it's your choice about how you propagate that, if you allow that to continue, or if you dismiss the irrationality of investors, for example. If you say, well, you guys are looking for data that you believe certain data to be true, actually that's not true. Here is the corrected take on that data, or our correct analysis on that data. And that is exactly what activist investors and short sellers and climate change activists and social movements, that is what they try and do as well. And they benefit hugely from this data. The ability to say, to look at the way institutional capital is being allocated to a particular company, that they have an agenda around the legitimacy of that corporation's activities, or the legitimacy of management's activities, and they want to change that. So their ability to say, well, we can see from the AI that institutional investors believe X. Actually, that's not true. And let me tell you why. And because if I can change your views, if I can change your opinions, I can change how you allocate capital. And once that begins to happen, you end up in a situation where investors, agency theory kicks in, and the owners of the business, the fractional owners of the business, the shareholders essentially, are able to rein in some of that control over management and over corporates. And you see this with climate change a lot.
You preempted one of the things that I wanted to ask about, really, because this year we've had a couple of guests on talking about ESG from a variety of perspectives. And I did want to put it to you, really, in terms of ESG and activism, the role that AI can play in that, good and bad. Maybe you could expand on what you were saying just now in that context.
The idea of good and bad. So we have no take on that, right? We don't know what is good and we don't know what is bad. And even for activism, right? I think you say, well, is this good or is this bad? Well, that really depends on which side of the fence you sit, right? Or which side of the coin. So the activists would say it's a good thing. Climate change is a good example, right? If we are able to convince fossil fuel industry, for example, not to increase carbon dioxide emissions, and therefore this stabilizes the environment a bit or doesn't make the environment worse, then that's arguably, they would say, a good thing. The fossil fuel companies may also take the view that that's a bad thing, because in order for that to happen, they need to reduce revenue, reduce income, so on and so forth, and that's therefore a negative thing. Of course, the flip side is the fossil fuel industry may say that that negatively impacts shareholders. Actually, all that you're doing is you're allowing shareholders in the future, shareholders 50 years away, 100 years away, shareholders that haven't yet been born, to realize some of the economic potential, the utility from owning that stock in that company, even though they have no need to do so at the moment. So in a way, I think, how is AI well geared to help with this? I think the secret, or the way in which this is going to happen, is it's not going to be about a machine learning to recognize patterns, data. It's not going to be machines learning to generate faces or cartoons or videos or funky pictures. It's going to be when AI has the capability to shape and influence human interactions. And we're already getting there. With ChatGPT, you see this. So ChatGPT is a language model. And of course, you and I, even now, we are communicating through language. Your perception about whether or not I'm a real person or a computer is based on my linguistic competence. How do I sound? How do I stutter? How do I change what I'm saying? How do I evolve my language? Whereas when that gets so good that you can't even determine whether or not I am a real person or not, but the message remains the same, the message is being generated by a machine, I find that very interesting. When a piece of AI has the capability to reshape human society and the way in which humans understand and interact with their world, how you, Dan, and I have Grant has a conversation, and information is exchanged from one person to another, and how does that process, that entrainment, happen from neural entrainment from my brain into your brain, so you make sense of what I'm saying, hopefully. How does that happen? Because when language, you and I use language to do that, right? We use language to make ourselves happy or sad. We can read poetry or books where the author of those books died hundreds of years ago, and we can still feel the emotions that the authors engineered in us: happiness or sadness, anger or love. We can still feel those emotions using just language. And now with ChatGPT, that is what machines are able to do, right? They're able to engineer and create language, not for their benefit, they don't really care, right? But actually, those words, those sequence of words, have power over you and I and anybody else reading them. And therefore, AI has the capability of exerting influence. And I think that's where, with regard to activism, that is where we will see AI being used in the future in activism. How do you get a machine to change the way in which an investor allocates their capital? I mean, this goes back to 2007, right? King and Sol, the paper where they asked, are activists aware of what they're doing, of this relationship between their protests and their actions and investors' choice about how investors allocate capital. King and Sol asked the paper in 2007, so a really long time ago now. Okay, it's not that long ago, but it's quite a long time ago. Certainly in AI space, a time, and I find that is an interesting idea, and how you get a machine to change your mind.
Yes, absolutely. You know, talking about language and all of that sort of thing. I think last week or two weeks ago, I was browsing around on YouTube and I came across a talk with Noam Chomsky. This was revolving around the ChatGPT thing and all of that sort of thing. And he seems like wholly unimpressed by the whole thing. He views it as a feat of engineering and not a threat in terms of scientific endeavor or anything like that, which he sees as entirely separate from what LLMs are capable of doing. But yeah, that aspect of language, broadening that out to AI in general, I was thinking about now a separate point entirely. Early on in your career in finance, you were part of Irithmics, and you established their European fund and asset management analytics and consulting capabilities. And of course, Irithmics, founded on some absolutely brilliant work. If at that time there had been access to machine learning, there had been access to artificial intelligence in terms of how we have it today. Do you think that in the Irithmics case, in that sort of innovative case, what were the things that might have been gained and what were the things that might have been lost?
Well, that's a very open-ended question, right? It's a really hard question. So firstly, Irithmics was successful, incredibly successful, because it was filled with incredibly brilliant people. And it was the people that made Irithmics incredible, really incredible. And the ability to have an idea and that run with that idea and bounce that idea off other equally brilliant people just means that ideas grow exponentially. So I think if AI or technology was in its current form in a room full of currently brilliant people or the same type of people that made Irithmics incredible at that time, I think a couple of things would have happened. First, the asset management industry would have focused much more on using this technology to create better products for their customers, their asset owners. They would have folded some of that technology into the products that they offered, so that if you're an asset owner or if you're an end investor, the products that the asset management industry offer you are much more sentient, or not sentient, it's the wrong word, much more salient to your needs. And that, I think, would be a really strong thing. You'd have a product that is really incredibly applicable and salient to what it is you're trying to do. I think we possibly, and I couch this very carefully, so some of the crises that we've run through recently, the financial crisis, the current issue with the US banking sector, some of that would be a little bit more transparent. I mean, even now you can log into Irithmics and see that this vicarious risk is alerting people, alerting our clients, alerting the quantitative managers that consume our data to the fact that other people think something is a bit miss with these companies. It doesn't know what they think. I mean, it could be everything from the coffee machine in the lobby not working to, board failures or whatever. We don't know that. We simply know that other people are behaving in a way that suggests that they have figured something out. Whatever that it is, we don't know. And I think that's where quants are becoming really useful, right? So when they look at this data and they're able to say, well, can we develop a model that either generates P&L or, more correctly, attributes risk, factoring these insights from other people into our models? That's a really interesting idea. And actually, it's funny you mentioned Rhythmics. There was a chap, a really brilliant man, Greg Berman, and at the time at Rhythmics, he was kicking the idea around about, what does Rhythmics not make some of its code open source? And his rationale for this was, you go. It is exactly the rationale I just said a few minutes ago. You suddenly go from having a handful of quant analysts that are trying to produce these valuation, risk, pricing functions to thousands, all trying to contribute their own understanding. And it's true, you don't know what they're doing or how they're doing it. It's like the murky world of some an algorithm that's partially outsourced and open sourced, and you can only partly see what it's doing. A bit like ChatGPT, right? You don't really know everything that it's doing, but it creates this illusion that it is doing something more meaningful. And that's why Chomsky is a little bit dismissive of it, right? It's just linear algebra and data. That's fundamentally all that it is.
Yes, exactly. I decided that about 6 months ago, I decided to stop using Google Maps when I'm driving. Again, driving. I started enjoying driving again. I don't know whether using Google Maps during my drive over the last, 8 years or so had shrunk my hypothalamus. London cabbies are meant to have the largest hypothalami in the world because of imbibing the knowledge. And that thought was in my mind. And I just wasn't learning as much as I used to do when driving, because I wasn't observing as much as to what was going on around me. So I quit using the Google Maps, and driving became enjoyable again. And I actually picked up more information that was actually salient for future drives as a result. So apropos to nothing, I was thinking about, in terms of loss with AI, it makes the drudge work no longer a drudge, right? That's one sort of selling point. And also something that concerns a lot of people who earn their money from doing drudge work, obviously, which we'll get to later on. But it takes the drudge work out of things. But in that drudgery, it's sort of like doing an apprenticeship, isn't it? You do all the hard stuff, the boring stuff, which then puts the exciting stuff sort of into context, I think. Any view on that sort of dynamic?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? So the drudge work, and it's funny you should mention the apprenticeship type structure, because it's a good metaphor. It's a really good metaphor. Human beings learn in very different ways to machines. What do human beings consider drudge work? A machine does not. In fact, a machine doesn't have any feeling about the work that it's doing. It doesn't wake up in the morning and go, oh, great, I'm formatting this spreadsheet. Or, oh, great, I have a call with Dan. I need to figure out what I'm doing. It doesn't.
The call with Dan is the drudge work, I think.
I'm sorry, Dan. I didn't understand that. Sorry, that was a very bad joke. However, the machines don't. They really don't see the world the same way as we do. So, in a way, are we alleviating the drudge work? Well, in a way, yes, we are. The drudge work that humans consider drudge work. But, you end up, anyone who's ever worked in data science will tell you that the huge amount, in fact, in your introduction, you touched on this, right, is the quality of the data that matters. And so there's a huge amount of effort that goes into data engineering and the pipeline and the cleaning and the processing of the raw data before you get the super, exciting, lovely, everyone wants to be a rocket scientist, everyone wants to be a data scientist, everyone wants to be the surgeon that sort of save someone's life, but they don't realize that in that operating theater there are technicians and nurses, and there are people that are making the scalpels, and there are people that there's an entire orchestra to get to the point where one person is the person who takes the credit or the blame for saving this other person's life. And I think this whole ecosystem that we're in, AI only forms one tiny part of that. The thing that matters most is the relation to me as a human being, is my relationship to other human beings, my family, my colleagues, my clients. Those things matter hugely to me, and some of that undoubtedly will have drudge work, will be huge drudge work. Should AI take that away? I think probably not, for the same reason as you touched on before with the apprenticeships, right? There is a certain amount of I need to go through this process so that it makes me, Grant, a better person. And if I simply short circuit that, fast track that, and get to the end result without actually learning what to do, actually, I'm probably not adding as much value as people think I am if I've simply done that. So, there is a reason why apprenticeships take a really long time. It's because you have to learn these skills. And unfortunately, I do an awful lot of work with universities, and I think students are so keen to present themselves workplace ready that they forget that this period of time, this 3 or 4 years at university, it's perfectly allowable to fail, because you're in a very nice, safe environment where you can form your thoughts. You don't even have to think the right things. You just have to think clever and creative and unique things, and have the intellectual ability to shape those thoughts. That takes time. It's a human. There's a certain amount of inertia that you cannot overcome by being a human, because we have neurons and we have cells in our bodies, and those cells, the amount of calcium it takes, calcium ions a fixed amount of time to move from A to B. And a computer, AI, does not have that problem. It has totally different problems, and that is its problem. My problem and your problem are human ones. I'm not saying you have problems.
Who doesn't have problems, Grant? What you've just said there, sort of. So we see with ChatGPT, which is going to lead to something. I am going to eventually get back to quant finance, but with ChatGPT, so a new job has been created. A ChatGPT prompter or prompt type thing. So they're employing people, positions are being advertised for people who can formulate prompts for ChatGPT, which will elicit the most commercially usable response, I guess. So, you know, I would assume, you know, in the early days of search engines and so on, quite a few people sort of prided themselves on being sort of Google jockeys, you know, knowing how to, knowing what sort of search phrases would elicit the most useful responses from a search engine. And I guess a ChatGPT prompter would be able to formulate the most appropriate prompt as I described just now. But in order to be able to formulate that prompt, I would say that you would need to have some sort of understanding of what it is you're looking for in order to be able to discern whether the response was actually the best possible response and the appropriate response and all of that sort of thing. So as a result, to a certain extent, you would have had to have gone through that drudge work in the past of learning the basics, knowing what the relevant sources would be and all of that sort of thing in order to use the technology, use the tool in the most effective way possible. So perhaps a worry, I mean, I'm not particularly worried about it, but I'll just say I am for dramatic sake. If people don't go through that period of doing the boring stuff and doing the traipsing around and learning the fundamentals and all of that sort of thing, then how are you going to know what the best question is to ask? How are you going to know whether an answer is not just salient, but actually innovative? So I suppose that maybe that's what I was driving at a little bit.
So you've asked me questions, right? So here's one for you about, do you think when you work with somebody, on one part, you rely upon them to have physical skills, right? The surgeon is a good example. The airline pilot is another good example. You touched on this in something you said before about your accountant. All of that, you're relying on, there is a certain amount of physical skill that this other human being needs to be proficient in order to have a relationship with you. But the other side of that is there is an interpersonal skill, something that you need to trust this person. You need to work very closely with this person. A good thing is surgeons, again, right? You're about to be anesthetized. They are literally about to take you to the point of death, paralyze you, so you can't move. They stop all your breathing. You're not unable to breathe apart from a machine or feel anything. They, to all intents and purposes, they have basically killed you. And then somebody's going to operate and, stick something into your brain or into your heart, or into something that essentially is a bad thing. You generally try and avoid that. And the same is with airline pilots, right? You're about to, for all the finesse that we socially dress this up as, you're getting into a sealed metal tube, and somebody is going to hurl that metal tube down runway at 400 miles an hour, and then you're going to become airborne and fly around the world at 13,000 feet at 400 miles an hour, and eventually land again. And in order to do that, you expect certain degrees of competence, technical competence, from the surgeon, from the airline pilot, everything, right? But also, at the end of the day, you need to know that the person who's about to stick the tube into your brain or hurl you down the runway at 400 miles an hour, actually, do you trust them? Do you, as a person, trust them? Because I promise you, if if somebody said to you, "Oh, here's Dan, here's your brain surgeon, he's about to perform some surgery on you. He just qualified medical school last week. You would begin to have second thoughts about, is this a really good idea, right? Yeah, I'm sure technically you know what you're doing. You've passed all the tests, and we've seen this with ChatGPT, right? It passes medical school entrance exams or Harvard MBAs, and it passes all sorts of. It has knowledge. This is true, but do you trust it? Do you have a human rapport with the machine? And so when you're talking about prompt engineers, that's essentially what they're trying to do. They're trying to hack this system. They're trying to say, is it possible for me as a human being to figure out how to elicit a response in you, and the response that you give me elicits a response in somebody else? So we're back to Keynes there, right? Anticipate the anticipations of others. And, it's that Richard Thaler who, he won the Nobel Prize for Economics. I think it was 2017. Please don't quote me on that. But for what became known as nudge theory. And he very insightfully said that Keynes's analogy for that phrase, Keynes's so-called beauty contest, is a perfect analogy of how financial markets work. And the analogy that Keynes used, the beauty contest, was, you have a set of pictures and you have to choose, and you are rewarded for picking not the face that you think is most pretty or most handsome or most human, but the face that you think other people are going to pick as the most handsome, most pretty, most human. When you look at, and you see this with ChatGPT, right? This is why they use human reinforcement learning or human feedback to guide and curate this. So now you're in the position where you have a machine, an algorithm, and data that is learning to produce a response, not that it finds interesting, it finds useful, but that humans find interesting and humans find rewarding. So if you cast your mind back, a few years ago, GANs were all the rage, right? And you were seeing the greatest advancements were the fact that GANs could generate human faces of people that did not exist. I'm sure you remember all of that, right? So the neural network, the GAN that does this, has absolutely no idea that this is a human face. None at all. It's presented with a random matrix of data and noise, and it converts that random matrix into another matrix of data. It doesn't know that the output is a human face. It simply knows that it is rewarded or it is not punished, or it receives some pat on the back for this correct answer. And one of the interesting things is, GANs are known to be incredibly unstable. Everyone who's worked with them will flag this up and say, oh, they're very difficult to train, they're very unstable. One of the things that they mean by that is that the GAN will always produce the same answer, because it's learned that a picture of Dan is always seen as a human face, right? Therefore, whatever data you give it, the answer will always be a face of Dan, because that's what it's learned to do. So now you get to a really interesting social thing where if the computer learns not to give the right answer, but the answer that it is expecting everybody else will consider the right answer, then you're in the whole Keynes beauty contest, right? Where now suddenly we are, you're not truly giving me your answer, what you really think. You're giving me the answer that you think I want to hear when you think. And that, to come full circle, that is essentially why we use AI to measure vicarious risk. Because if you ask portfolio managers, institutional investors, what do you think about Apple or Microsoft or Oracle or Tesla, for example? They're not going to tell you, for all sorts of reasons. They're not going to be totally honest, totally revealing. So the only way for you to extrapolate that is to look at what they actually do, because how they really allocate capital tells you something about what they really believe. And that's why we use AI for vicarious risk. But it's interesting how you get to a point where AI is able to, I don't want to use the word manipulate, because everyone in financial services takes that correctly so to be a negative word, but negative connotations. But now you're in a state where AI is able to influence human behavior and human choice. And choice is, is you sit down and say, well, do you have free choice? Of course you will say, yes, of course I do. But how do you express agency? And when a machine is able to say, Dan, you too can be truly unique if you bought more of X, and you go, yes, I can really see how a yellow puffer jacket would make me truly unique. It really would, Dan. I promise you, it would make you very unique. So go off and buy that. The algorithm has optimized output. It gets a reward. It sees revenue sales increase. It's done its job. But in order to do so, it's influenced you to do something, to exercise agency. And I think that's the power of AI, for good and bad. You touched on this, is when AI learns how to optimize a problem space to get you to exercise agency in a way that AI has influenced. Because then you no longer have free will. Then a machine is telling you what to do.
Very interesting. This year we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Black-Scholes paper. Pre-Merton, we'll be celebrating Merton's contribution next year. But the Black-Scholes model, it's a performative model in that you see that. Rather ironically, seeing as Merton's father was the creator of the self-fulfilling prophecy hypothesis, the performative model essentially describes and then becomes the thing it models itself, as it were, just via adoption. The stories about Fisher Black going to the Chicago Board of Trade and basically selling sheets of prices that were established from his model, and the traders would buy those sheets and trade on that basis, and lo and behold, that is exactly where the prices found themselves. So, in a funny way, this is a sort of this idea that there is this I don't know whether you'd call it an echo chamber or something along those lines. This influence and feedback kind of loop, and what you've described there with the possibilities of AI sort of call that to mind for me.
So I think that the feedback mechanism is interesting, right? So we have a slightly different take on feedback in financial markets, and it's a really significant thing for us. So we call it isomorphic risk. So you have vicarious risk and isomorphic risk, or isomorphism. And this goes back to DiMaggio and Powell, years and years ago, where they so isomorphism for the uninitiated is essentially the way two different things are the same, even though they're different. So a really good example is, if you decide to buy a particular stock today, and I decide to buy a particular stock today, the underlying methodology that allowed you to do that and me to come to that decision may be very, very different, but the end result is the same, right? So those two decisions are isomorphic. They both independently resulted in the same outcome. Now, the view that we have, and this is why Irithmics is so instructive in this regard, is we can now begin to see that. We can see markets developing isomorphic features. And why that is really important is you're now able to understand and see when institutional portfolios are more likely to come to the conclusion to reallocate or allocate capital at the same time. And you don't know why they're doing this, right? But just at the same time, more institutional capital is going to create more demand, more supply in the market. And, economics 101 tells you what happens with other things that we measure and monitor price. So here then, do you get the feedback loop, which is your question? Do you say, does the market respond to the price movements? And yes, that is really true. In fact, price almost universally is one of the most significant attributes in any valuation model. It's by far not orders of magnitude, but by far it's the largest. And again, we can measure that. It's actually even larger than fundamentals like the balance sheet or cash flow or income statement. All of that, market price by far dominates this space. So yes, of course, there is a bit of a positive feedback, right? And you get the technical analysts that will go off and say, well, my breakout sequence or my Fibonacci bands and so on and so forth, this is all what it looks like, and therefore I'm going to do X, Y, Z. They're all behaving isomorphically. Their thinking is the same, and their conclusions that they derive from that data are the same. And therefore, you will see a mass of people buying because they've all analyzed the same data in the same way. And actually, that is the underlying mechanisms that power vicarious risk. The fact that similar investors, and by that I mean, do those institutions have similar portfolios, similar mandates, similar strategies, similar experiences? If the answer to all of those is yes, then quite logically, you would expect them to behave in a similar, not identical, but a similar way when they're presented with similar markets, similar environments, similar constraints. It's exactly the same, Dan. If you arrive to your doctor and you've got a sore throat and your throat is swollen and sore throat, and you tell the doctor that you've never had your tonsils removed, you'd sort of expect the doctor to arrive at one conclusion. If I went to see my doctor and I presented exactly the same symptoms, I would expect both of our doctors, even though they probably have never met each other ever, to come up with the same conclusion, right? Dan has tonsillitis, Grant has tonsillitis, or so whatever that conclusion happens to be. And by the way, here is a course of antibiotics or family of antibiotics that Dan would be put on, a family of antibiotics that Grant would be put on. And yep, they're broadly similar choices, similar responses, because both of those doctors were trained in a similar way to reach a similar conclusion when presented with the same or similar environments. Dan arriving, Grant arriving with these symptoms. So I think, does that become feedback happen? I think there's George Soros you said many insightful things, but one of which was that financial markets have this property called reflexivity, which is the very thing you're trying to optimize, price, right? You're rewarded by price. The very thing that you are interacting with changes as a function of your choice to engage with it. And so, yes, of course, you have a bit of feedback there, right? So if you buy, does the price go up or not?
Yes, precisely. In the context of AI and machine learning, AI especially, in the coding context, let's go into that. AI as a tool in the context of quant finance as a professional pathway, because clearly one of the things which AI will definitely be able to do is coding. And in our field, obviously we have quant developers aplenty who will certainly be affected by that particular role, will definitely be affected in the coming months, the coming years, and so on. So as a person who is well qualified to give an opinion on this, what would you say the key things are for somebody who is going into quant finance now or early on in their career, maybe as a quant developer, should be thinking about in terms of the trajectory that things are on, in terms of their development in this particular field?
Wow, you come up with some real gems, as in a really hard question, but really hard. I said before, I do an awful lot of work with universities and students, and this is a question that I get asked a lot. What do I see the career trajectory or the industry trajectory or the sector trajectory, and how can students best or more optimally choreograph things so that they come out of this in the best possible place? And I honestly don't know. I really don't know. I think, things move so quickly, and we, as human beings, we don't notice evolution because it's happening at a time scale that is much slower than our human lives. So we don't notice it. But with AI and technology and quantum finance, even medicine, right? These things are moving orders of magnitude faster than our lives. So you look back and you will say, well, in my lifetime, XYZ happened, and that now gets much shorter. So I think someone moving into quantum finance, any discipline, the first thing is that your first job in this domain is certainly not going to be your last job in this domain. And I would say you just need to make sure that you remain on top of things and abreast of things, and don't assume that because you've mastered the ukulele, all other instruments are going to be useful, like the ukulele, which I don't play, by the way. But I think so you've worked really hard for your degree and your qualification, and you're really keen to get off and build a career in quantum finance. This is understandable, but also do understand that career, that discipline will evolve and change, and you need to be savvy enough to understand where that is evolving and where that is changing. And part of that is just remaining networked with people. There's I can't remember who said it, but that's right, Asimov, the greatest, the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, one of the greatest phrases that has heralded more scientific discoveries is not a eureka, I've discovered it, but that's curious. And I think that sums up quant finance, in fact, any discipline to me. Why people are successful is they notice something, not I've discovered it, I've solved the option pricing structures of equity markets, for example, using the heat transfer function from physics, if we're talking about isomorphism. But just that's curious. And that's exactly how Irithmics ended up getting to the point of measuring vicarious risk, was to say, isn't it curious that we see this behavior, waves, quite literally, it's waves of behavior rippling through markets that mean that institutional investors, similar investors, are behaving in similar ways. Isn't that curious? And when you begin to scratch scratch that a bit more deeply, actually, it's not just curious, but many of our clients can profit from that and do profit from that. And I think that's the secret of quant finance, is to, yes, equip yourself with all the skills necessary, but for goodness sake, make sure you position yourself where you're not going to be lulled into a false sense of security and safety and do nothingness. Keep remaining curious, right? There is a reason you got into this space in the first place. It is your curiosity.
Words to live by, certainly. And another curiosity is that an exponent of the ukulele is Paul Wilmot. I'm not sure if that's the only instrument that he plays.
Is that true? I didn't know that.
It's true. It's true. I have seen a drum kit at his place many, many years ago. I don't know whether he was bashing it with the ukulele, though, or whether he actually treats it as an entirely separate instrument.
At school, everyone has school reports, right? And I had school reports that would say maths, Grant must do X, Y, Z, or whatever. English, Grant must learn to spell. Incidentally, I still can't spell. But my art report, I'm not joking, my art report came back to my parents and said, the sad thing is, I think Grant really is trying. If you ever want to persuade a child not to do art, ever, that is a perfect way to do it. Exactly.
Well, thank you very much, Grant, for your time. I would strongly urge listeners to the podcast. We're actually recording this very close to the day when Grant is going to be delivering his talk. It's just a few days away, so it's most likely that this will be released after the talk. But either way, the CQF Institute Global Talk by Dr. Grant Fuller on vicarious risk, estimating the risk identified by others, is available for free to CQF Institute members. And as always, as I always say, membership is also free, so you don't have any excuse. You'll be able to catch the video of that talk. There'll be a link available on the page here as well. Thanks again, Grant. I look forward to the next time we'll be able to catch up and discuss further where things have developed.
Thank you for listening to QuantSpeak. Don't forget to subscribe and do sign up to the CQF Institute for more insights into quant finance.